Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Stefan Fusenich and I'm going to be talking to you today about how you can ensure your students know more and remember more. So within today's webinar, we're going to look at a few key features. And one of those features is going to be looking at how we're able to understand the key considerations we need to take into account to make sure our students can know more and remember more. We'll also be looking to identify common misconceptions about successful learning. And will also help you get a better understanding of the importance of developing interconnections within the learning process to ensure your students can know more and remember more. So I hope you'll enjoy today's webinar. We'll be going through these things in some detail and hopefully we'll give you some practical ideas and tips about how you can make sure your students are knowing more and remembering more through the planning and effective delivery of your sessions. So what are the key considerations? Well, what we do need to know for when we're doing our curriculum planning is we need to know some key things. And one thing is that we know that progress means knowing more and remembering more. So if our students are making progress, we should be able to see them be able to know more and remember more. The other thing we need to think about within our planning is that prior knowledge allows us to learn new content. So think carefully about your students and what they've already learned and what they can do, together with the things that are new to them and what they might not be able to do and how you'll support them with those gaps. One of the other key considerations in our planning is we know that knowledge is connected to developing webs or schemas or schemata. So when we're thinking about developing our curriculum plan, we need to think carefully about mapping things together to create webs of learning or schematas which will allow students to link things together. So these are some of the key considerations. And finally, we know that vocabulary size actually relates to academic success. So what are you doing to help your students develop their technical vocabulary or general vocabulary through literacy improvements within your program? So think about these key things when developing your planning and developing your curriculum to help you make sure that your students can know more and remember more. So what do we mean by learning and progress? Well, learning has been defined in cognitive psychology as the alteration of your long-term memory. So actually, research shows that if nothing has been altered in your long-term memory, nothing has been learnt. So it's really important to think about what alterations have been made into the student's long-term memory and what can they do now that they couldn't do before and what are they able to remember. Now that means that learning has taken place. Progress, on the other hand, is knowing more and remembering more. Okay, so we basically have learned something and now we know more and we can remember more. And when new knowledge exists and connects in the student's mind, that gives them an understanding. So you can learn something, you can remember it and understand it. So that's the difference between learning and progress. Progress means that you are able to understand what you've been able to be learning. So as a student develops through this process, learning something and progressing, they develop some unconscious competency and fluency. Now, unconscious competency and fluency allows them to develop skills. So, for example, they can draw down the capacity to do complex technical skills with drawing down on what they know. So what have they learnt and how they can apply that into the situation. So it's really a key thing here about students in terms of learning and progress. They've lived, the two things here is learning is defined as changing your memory, and progress is being able to know more of it and remember more of it. So really important that we want our students to be able to know more and remember more. So we want them to have more things in their memory bank, but we also want them to be able to apply it regularly to show that progress. So what is remembering more? Well, remembering more, as we talked about, is long-term memory. And we would say that there's a change here in remembering more in your long-term memory. So we would say here that the big mental warehouse of things that we know would be our long-term memory. And these are organised into schemas as more complex learning takes place. So what happens is you can remember sometimes small amounts of information for a short duration. So if we keep repeating these things, we should be able to keep practicing them and repeating them, allow us to remember more. So if we can retrieve it, that's within our working memory. If we can't retrieve it, that means it's only within our short-term memory, and we will then forget it. So it's important when we're planning our learning to plan ample time and opportunity to allow students to practice skills to ensure that the change in learning stays within the long-term memory, to allow them to be able to retrieve it when they need it through developing a schema. So if we only are able to have small amounts of information in our memory for a small period of time, we forget it, and that's why we might see students where we're constantly having to repeat the technical skill that we're demonstrating to them because they're unable to remember it the first time round, and therefore maybe the way that we've developed our delivery or teaching is not supporting the development of long-term memory change. So really importantly here that we work on developing long-term memory change through those organised activities. So we want students to be able to have things in their warehouse and to be able to retrieve them whenever they want within their working memory, and that's the change that we're after. So too much information would mean that it's only in the short-term memory and students will forget it. And research shows that generally students will forget 70% of the things that they do within a lesson, and if they don't practice it afterwards, that's what would the amount that would be forgotten. If you do keep practicing or do things afterwards, that amount of memory that is retained is much higher. So in terms of students who have exams, it's always beneficial for them to make notes of after a session or practice or revise because it helps them remember more, and that can be taken into the process of practical teaching. That once you've done the skill in class, could the students go away and do more practice to allow them to develop that schema construction, that remembrance, that working memory there to allow them to develop and draw down and therefore we don't teach all of the things that the students need to know. Now, the bigger term impact here would be that the sort of social justice issues that students are not necessarily skilled or able to remember or draw down on the memory of things that we've taught them. So the qualification that they've got doesn't necessarily replicate the skills that they could do without support. So it's really important that we don't teach to the test, we don't narrow the curriculum down too much, because we want to make sure our students are able to demonstrate the technical skills that are expected from the qualification. So don't become hung up on teaching to the test. Teach the skills that students need to know, and as those skills become developed, students will be then able to take assessments and gain their qualification without issue. So part of our problem may be that we are repeating skills and knowledge because the students didn't learn them first time around, because we're trying to squeeze too much in to our lessons in terms of teaching to the test. And we talked about this before, talking about a tick box exercise to learning. And it's really important that we don't do that, because otherwise students won't be able to gain employment with the qualifications, because they won't be able to demonstrate their skills, because they haven't been able to remember or know what's been taught to them in class. They've just been able to, maybe learn by rote, by just be able to repeat something within that short space of time after practice for an assessment on the day, did the assessment, but they can't remember it. So really important that we take these issues into account, and we've probably seen that with some of our students before. So what do we mean then, and how will we get that memory and that progress to happen? Well, I've got a question here for you that I'd like you to take a pause in a minute to answer for yourself. So I want to ask you, which one of these patterns you think is most likely to result in long-term learning? So would it be study, 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 then recall, study, 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 recall, recall, study, study, recall, 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 or study, recall, 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 recall? And when I talk about this, it could be a pattern of lessons, it could be a set of activities within a class. So, for example, the first one, you could have maybe 4 activities in the class which are revolving around studying the subject, and then one part of recall at the end. Or it could be 4 lessons of theory followed by 1 lesson of practical. Okay, and the same as we work through, it could be 3 activities in the class followed by 2 recall activities, or 3 theory sessions followed by 2 practical. down to the bottom where we would do a small amount of study followed by lots of recall activities. Which one of the following do you believe would be most likely to ensure long-term memory and learning? So we talked about getting something in long-term memory bank, or having something in that short-term bank that is possibly forgotten. This is a piece of research done by Roger and Capric. So if you're interested in looking at this in a bit more detail, you can find this by putting those details into a search engine, and you'll find some articles that will come up with some details of the studies that they've done. So the answer to this question then is the fourth answer that we have on the list. Study, recall, recall, recall. And when we're talking about recall, we just don't mean by formal tests. It can be that learners are able to recall prior learning by applying it into new contexts. So I think it's really important that you think about that when you're delivering your sessions. That if you are the type of teacher that is teaching from the front for an hour, where is the opportunity for students to recall and practice the skills that you've taught them about? So our working memory is only able to hold a short amount of information. If we overload it, we forget lots of the information that we've been given. As I explained earlier, if you were to have a 1 hour theory session, by the time you walk out of the room, you'll have forgotten around about 70% of the information that you've just been given. So based on that, we should be delivering smaller amounts of theory with much more time for practice and recall to make sure we fully understand the information that would be given or the technique or skill that's been shown to us. So what we shouldn't do is show students when it comes to technical education the whole process without enabling them to have practice. We should break things down into smaller chunks and then give them more time to practice it to master the skills. So this is the answer that we've got there, is smaller amounts of study with much more time for recall and practice. So this is the way that technical education will allow students to remember more and know more, but that means a change in our mindset and our ways of working to ensure that we allow ample time for practice. This is great because it allows the tutor to check learning, allows us to circulate around the room and support learners that maybe just aren't quite getting it yet. So we can spend more time on supporting them to get the recall, understand and practice. So as we talked about before, in the first instance, if you've got lots of theory with only a small amount of recall, there's not much opportunity to practice in different contexts and not much opportunity for a teacher to support. So if you're going to be able to know more and remember more, you should be able to apply your knowledge or your answer in different situations and contexts. And what we mean by that would be that maybe you do a short amount of theory within a session, and you could ask your students then to complete some questions, read a case study, do some Q&A or group discussion. You should be able to apply that knowledge within those different situations to gain a greater understanding of what the learning is that they've just done. The same for practical. It could be that you've demonstrated to students a particular technique on one piece of wood or one piece of material, and they demonstrate that technique in different situations, on different sizes, different lengths, different things. So can you put them into situations where they're going to have to try that skill multiple times in multiple different ways, rather than just the one way that they would be assessed or the one way that you've demonstrated, because that will show if the learners have actually been able to store that knowledge in their working memory, and can they do it automatically in different situations, which is really what we want from students who are doing technical education, is that they're able to apply their learning and knowledge into different contexts and deal with the challenges that they've been faced with in the workplace. So that's the answer to that study, and that's what the research showed, is that really it's a build-up of knowing more and remembering more. So what we want to see is effective teaching. That means that learners know more and can remember more of what they've learned. And to do that, we need to give more opportunities for learners to apply that knowledge into different situations. So the mindset of the teacher is really important. It's very unhelpful as a teacher to think of your students' or pupils' minds as an empty vessel, waiting to be filled with isolated, disconnected pieces of information. People learn knowledge when new concepts are connected in their minds with what they've already learned. So what it's really important to think about is what your students or pupils have learned previously, and what have they done in the sessions before or after, and what have they done in previous qualifications that will allow you to get an idea of what information that they need to be able to put the pieces together. So almost joining the dots of this web. some students will have more knowledge already, so will need less time on certain aspects. And some students may be totally new to this skill or this qualification, and therefore will need more time and more support to actually do that. So your mindset as a teacher needs to be not that you're just delivering to everybody at the same level and the same speed, but also the fact that there are other situations that are playing a part in this, that some students know more, some students know less. Now, the other thing is as well, we need to dispel some myths and some of the things that we tend to think about as being things that have an impact on learning. And one of the things that we need to remove from our mindset is the idea of Bloom's taxonomy, and that in terms of it being a useful tool for developing learning outcomes, it isn't always necessarily the fact that higher order skills are the things that need to be taught last in terms of every task. So it depends on the student's knowledge that where they are in the baseline of Bloom's taxonomy in terms of their learning. But we may have times and instances where actually some of those higher order skills are the skills that need to be learned within the baseline learning to actually complete the task. So don't always think that you're building everybody from the bottom up. In some instances, students need to learn a higher level task because they've already got some previous information there to allow them to proceed. The other myth is about learning styles and teaching students to their preferred learning style. Now, yes, we will have preferred ways of learning, but we shouldn't entirely ensure students are taught in that way, because it won't help them always develop the knowledge and skills that they require to actually be successful in the workplace, but also in some instances to remember more of the things that they need to do. So we need to challenge students with working out of their comfort zone in their other learning styles that they would use, and actually develop those skills to enable them to remember more, to apply that knowledge into different situations. And the final thing to think about is that we do need to make sure we teach students and make adaptations to meet their needs. These are some of the key things that need to be thought about within our planning and what we do to make sure that we're not being sort of working within the methods of teaching and learning, that there are only certain ways to do things. What is really important is that we adapt and support students in the ways that they need to, but we challenge them to develop their knowledge and skills at the right speed, at the right level, without always thinking we have to teach the preferred learning style or teach within a set order of Bloom's taxonomy. So really important there to think about what progress will look like and where students might be within their progress map. So how do we do that then? Well, developing interconnections in learning is going to be really key. And what we call schemas are something that I talked about quite a lot in knowing more and remembering more. And it's more appropriate to understand that memory is stored in interconnected webs, or a schema, and that every time a student or a pupil encounters the word that they previously learned but applied in a new context, it adds to the complexity of their understanding of the concept. So that's why we talked about allowing students to think about situations or different ways of learning and thinking in different places. So in other words, they develop a deeper understanding of the concept and enhance their capacity to use that concept within their own thinking. So by challenging students to understand what we've talked about in a different situation, allows us to see that they have learned it, can apply it, but also can remember what to do with that skill. So, for example, a good example is mathematics, for example, when you're learning about how to divide, you may be able to do the sums that you've been shown on the board, and you may understand that process. But asking students to do it with different sets of numbers, of different ways of the sums being delivered, allows you to see if they are able to, develop those webs and those connections with, oh yes, this is how I did it for that one, this is how it will be done for this one. That can be applied within technical ways as well. So if you look at electrics, for example, looking at wiring systems, the students will know about the basics of the wires and the different ways that things need to be wired up. Can they wire up different objects to what you've shown them to allow them to demonstrate that skill, and actually placing them in those different situations allows them to place that learning into a different concept or context, and allows them to develop a more complex understanding. And within their working memory, they can refer back to that situation where they were changing that plug, and that's the way that the wires were done on that plug. This plug looks slightly different, but it can still be done in this way. So it's just about developing those connections in learning to allow students to reflect. So what are some of the obstacles then? Well, some of the obstacles that we might find is that some pupils or students lack prior knowledge or learning. They may find it difficult to learn new knowledge or skills because their short-term working memory can become overloaded. So if you don't actually know something, you can become overloaded and may not be able to succeed with what you're hoping to learn. Now, if they're able to draw down on their long-term memory and attend to a small number of new features of learning, they're much more likely to progress. And this is why we go back to that study, recall, recall, recall. Smaller amounts of learning, stopping that overloading, meaning that you can recall what you've just been shown and try to apply it in the situation that you've just been learned. So too many steps is often an obstacle from developing long-term learning. And it might be that because we expect students to have already known something, we give them additional steps because we think they understand the basics. It's really important to think about where the starting point is, not just for some students in your group, but for everybody in the group, to make sure you can support them to remember the skills that they need and give them the right bit of information to allow them to progress. So when we talk about overloading the working memory, here are some examples of the types of things that would overload the working memory. One thing that often teachers do, and students tell us that we do, is that the tasks are too complex with multiple steps. Okay, so we have too many steps within our tasks, and that stops students being successful. The other thing that we often do is that we might place social demands in the task. So we ask students to work in pairs or group work too early in the learning process before they fully understood what they're being asked to do. And that added dimension of having to work with somebody else or having to discuss with somebody else can stop students being able to apply that learning as easily. So think about when we talk about an opportunity for assessment, can you allow an opportunity for students to consolidate the learning on their own first before working together with other people? So they develop their confidence and then they can apply that learning into that new situation that we just talked about. The other thing that we've just talked about more before was that learners' prior knowledge is weak, and that actually the students don't understand what we thought they did. And that's really important, that we can be overloading the working memory because our expectations of students are beyond that of what their current capabilities are. So I think it's really important that you think about the level of understanding that your students have got and find out what their baseline learning is. Because if you don't, you might find that you're overloading the working memory, which prevents students from retaining the information that you're giving them. They'll only retain that small amount. And the other part is that your learning environment has got too many unhelpful distractions. So think about your learning environment. Is it a positive learning environment, or is it an environment that means that students become distracted? We could talk about behaviour of other students. We could talk about the actual walls or the room. Making sure that the environment has got low level distraction and disruption means that students will be able to remember more in their working memory. So if you think about it logically, if you've got students talking in the background while you're talking, that will mean that students maybe aren't always getting the information that they need, get quite frustrated, and that their memory of the things that you've talked to them about has been disrupted, and therefore they can't actually remember how to do the task properly. So really important that you get good classroom management in place to allow you to make sure that there's minimum disruption in terms of the learning process. So think about those types of things and make sure that you're working to ensure that there's good environment for learning and that students are able to be successful. So here's an overview then of what we've talked about in terms of making sure your students can know more and remember more. The first thing is to plan for progress. When you're developing your schemes of work and your lesson plans, make sure there's clear progress within learning. Identify the components that learners need to achieve to be able to demonstrate a particular outcome. We call these concept thresholds. And these things are the skills or knowledge that students really need to know as a basic to be able to perform other tasks. Now check the knowledge and skills deficits of your learners, find out what their starting points are so that you're able to support them effectively. And where students know less than others, ensure these deficits are addressed. Make sure you plan to allow ample time to support those students within the session. The other thing is make interconnections in your learning. Make sure that one lesson leads to the next, and that there's a chance and opportunity to practice applying your skills in different concepts and the contexts. And the other thing is make sure you adapt your teaching in a way that improves learning, making sure that you're responsive to the needs of learners. Make sure that you're given ample time and opportunity to check learning, check progress, and make steps to support students who maybe aren't learning as quickly as you like. So it's really important that you do undertake those steps and make sure that you are checking about the learning process to allow your students to know more and remember more. So importantly, don't overload their work and memory with too many steps, with too much information. Make sure you've got an environment within the classroom that allows them to be able to focus and to be able to get on with the job in hand. We talked about the other fact as well, about making sure that you don't introduce group work too early within a concept or a topic. So make sure you give your students maybe some time before that on an individual basis to practice and master those skills before you add the extra complexity of working together with others on the task. That's a great way to maybe cement that learning within the longer term memory because it's a different context. Working together with somebody else, explaining to them what you're doing or asking them about what they're doing is a great way to move forward with this process, but not maybe possibly in the first instance when we're trying to get students to know and remember more. So thanks for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar about getting your students to know and remember more. And if you have, why not watch one of the others in the series? We've got some webinars about effective sequencing. We've got some about motivational dialogue. We've got another webinar that talks about TMET specifics, challenges for management as well within there. We've also got a webinar that looks at some other aspects of teaching pedagogy. So please join us for some of the other webinars.